So in this lesson, we're going to learn the difference between moderating variables and mediating variables. Moderating and mediating variables are variables that affect the relationship between two other variables in some way. In that sense, they would both be considered third variables. So let's start with variables that moderate the relationship between two other variables. Now, a moderating variable is a variable that affects the strength or regulates the relationship between two other variables. And depending on our analytical framework, we might call one of the other variables a predictor variable or an independent variable, usually with the label X. The other variable might be called the criterion variable, dependent variable, or outcome variable, usually with the label Y. So now, regardless of how the other two variables are labeled, their relationship can only be fully understood by taking into account the role of the moderator variable, sometimes labeled Z. Now here's another way to look at it. Although we may know that a predictor has a relationship with an outcome variable, so does the moderator. In fact, the presence of the moderator may strengthen the relationship between the predictor and the outcome variable. Now, if that's the case, then the moderator interacts with the predictor to have an effect on the outcome variable. And in statistics, this is commonly known as an interaction effect, and we can test for it. Now, we see moderating variables in everyday relationships. For example, a woman's satisfaction with life may be related to the quality of her relationship with her husband. However, her life satisfaction may also be due, in part, to the fact that her children are living at home. Now, if the children were to leave, her satisfaction with life might decrease significantly. So having her children at home interacted with or moderated the degree to which her relationship with her husband brought her overall life satisfaction. Now, we see moderating variables in clinical contexts as well. So, for example, people who experience a traumatic event often have symptoms of post-traumatic stress afterward. However, that's not the whole story. Pinellas and colleagues in 2011 found that those individuals who relied on an avoidant coping style were more likely to experience post-traumatic symptoms 3 months following a trauma. In other words, the tendency to avoid thinking about or discussing a traumatic event made it more likely that an individual would experience post-traumatic stress symptoms later. So the avoidant coping style moderated the relationship between the stressor and the subsequent symptoms. By avoiding dealing with one's symptoms, the symptoms actually worsened. In contrast, a mediating variable is one that explains the relationship between two variables. It doesn't modulate or regulate the relationship, it makes the relationship possible to begin with. Mediating variables are often, but not always, intrinsic to or part of the organism. You can kind of think of a mediator as a clasp. If you were trying to link two chains together, the clasp would be necessary to secure the linkage. Without the clasp, the link wouldn't occur. So here's a good example. Many factors account for language expression. Everyday speech is in response to environmental stimulation or cues and can only occur once an individual has learned words, grammar, and syntax. Even something as simple as recognizing a face and saying the word face requires mediation by the brain. Expressive language is mediated by certain brain regions in the left hemisphere, like Wernicke's area and Broca's area. When those areas are damaged by a stroke or an accident, language is either impaired, maybe lost completely. Thus, those areas of the brain mediate language expression. Now, in clinical research, mediating variables are important to account for. For example, bipolar disorder is a serious mental health disorder that involves extreme high and low moods. Milkowitz and Scott in 2009 conducted a meta-analysis of many studies and found across studies that some treatments, like cognitive behavior therapy, were reliably associated with reduced rates of relapse. However, other variables mediated treatment outcome and the probability of relapse, and one of those was medication adherence. Without medication adherence, the likelihood of therapy preventing relapse was slim. However, medication adherence by itself was not sufficient to prevent relapse. So the authors concluded that medication adherence mediated the relationship between therapy and relapse prevention. Now, it is important to note that most analyses of mediation and moderation are based on quasi-experimental or correlational research designs. As such, knowing that a variable moderates or mediates a relationship is not the same as saying that there is a causal relationship. Only controlled experimental studies can speak to causal relationships. Most clinical research does not have that kind of control. That being said, correlation is a requisite feature of causation. And while they're not the same, as Randall Munroe, the cartoonist behind Calvin and Hobbes, once said, correlation does not imply causation, but it does waggle its eyebrows suggestively and gesture furtively while mouthing, "Look over here." According to Barron and Kinney, 1986, 3 conditions are necessary for mediation of 2 variables to occur. Now let's start with a predictor that is significantly related to an outcome variable. So for example, we'll relate these 2 variables and say probability of that relationship due to chance or measurement error is less than 5 in 100. First, an independent variable must be related to the mediating variable and account for significant amounts of variance in the mediating variable. Second, the mediating variable must likewise do the same for an outcome variable. It must be related to the outcome variable and account for significant amounts of variance. And then the third part, and this is maybe the most important part, once the relationship between the mediating variable, the one in blue, and the outcome variable is taken into account, the relationship between the independent variable and the outcome variable is no longer statistically significant. In other words, it kind of just disappears. Researchers often use analysis of variance to test for moderating effects, but not for mediating effects. Instead, mediating effects are usually tested through a series of regression models. The general sequence is to first run a regression model in which the mediator is regressed on the predictor, or independent variable. Then in the second step, there is a regression of the dependent variable on the independent variable. And the final step is to regress the dependent variable on both the independent variable and the mediator. Now, examination of the 3 regression equations is then conducted, and if a variable is a significant mediator, then the predictor, or independent variable, must account for significant variance in the mediating variable in that first equation. In the second equation, the predictor, or independent variable, must account for significant variance in the outcome or dependent variable. And then finally, in the third regression equation, and this may be the most important part, the mediating variable must account for significant variance in the outcome variable, and the effect of the independent variable must be less than in the second regression equation. Now, in perfect mediation, the predictor, or x, no longer has any effect on the dependent variable, or y, when the mediator z is included in the regression equation. Now, that's mediators. How to test for moderating effects of variables depends upon the nature of the variables involved and whether they are categorical or continuous. In the simplest case, the moderating variable and the independent variable are categorical, and the dependent variable is continuous. This is the most efficient analysis. You may recognize it as a 2x2 analysis of variance, or ANOVA. So a statistically significant interaction effect would suggest the presence of a moderating variable. From there, the situation then gets more complicated if the variables involved are, say, continuous rather than categorical. For example, if the potential moderators and outcome variables are continuous, then you would in fact use a series of regression analyses to conduct the examination of the data. Now here's a good example of using regression to identify a moderator. Let's look at the trauma research done by Pinellas and colleagues that we talked about earlier. Recall that in their study, PTSD symptom severity was the outcome variable, and you can see it right here on the table. Initial trauma reactivity at 1 month, or TR, was the predictor, and the moderating variable was avoidant coping style. Note that the TR by avoidant coping interaction was statistically significant for total PTSD symptoms, re-experiencing symptoms, and numbing symptoms. That's what the significant interaction refers to. An avoidant coping style moderated the relationship between initial trauma reactivity and certain PTSD symptoms at 3 months. Now, we can also express this moderating relationship graphically. You might recognize the intersecting lines here of the graph as indicative of an interaction effect. We would interpret this graph in the following way. We'd say at time 2, which was 3 months post-trauma, PTSD symptoms were the highest in individuals who showed high reactivity to begin with and were most avoidant in dealing with their trauma. So that takes us to power issues. What is power? Power refers to the likelihood of detecting a relationship between two variables when it actually exists in the population. That's the same as saying it is the likelihood of correctly rejecting a null hypothesis. High-powered designs provide the necessary conditions to reject the null hypothesis when, in fact, it should be rejected. In contrast, low-powered designs often result in a failure to detect a relationship that should have been detected. Now, the most frequent culprit for low power is a sample size that's pretty small. So detecting statistically significant moderating effects requires a very large sample size. And because clinical samples are often difficult to collect, many samples are too small, and these studies are unable to detect the effects of moderating variables. In many cases, moderators are discovered post hoc, after the fact, and must be tested in subsequent studies. So as a result, this makes the process of identifying reliable moderating variables pretty lengthy and cumbersome. Identifying moderating and mediating variables is important for several reasons. So first, if we don't understand which variables moderate or mediate relationships between other variables, then we don't truly understand how a system functions. It is rarely the case that there is a one-to-one correspondence between a stimulus and a response. Now, early on, psychologists recognized that information from the environment had to be first processed in some way by the organism before a response would occur. The nature of the response was determined both by the type of stimulus and the type of organism. So as information and stimuli became more complex, verbal, symbolic, the role of processes that either moderated or mediated relationships necessarily increased. Now, there are also practical reasons why it is important to understand the role of moderating and mediating variables. Think about our example regarding the relationship of avoidant coping style to the expression of trauma symptoms. These variables can have direct implications for decision-making among clinical psychologists, health policy professionals, and politicians. From a policy standpoint, the research also suggests that there is value in providing therapy following trauma. This has implications for thinking of psychotherapy as a legitimate and valuable mental health treatment for individuals. Another clear implication is that clinical psychologists should do what they can to help clients come to terms with the trauma they experienced. Avoidance doesn't work. From a therapeutic standpoint, the research provides justification for helping clients process and deal with a traumatic event rather than avoid it. So hey, you learned a lot. Now it's time for the lightning round. Here are a few questions to reinforce your learning. Pause the video after each question and then pick an answer. Resume the video to see if you answered correctly. So, which of the following statements is true? A moderating variable accounts for the relationship between two other variables. A mediating variable modulates or regulates the relationship between two other variables. Analysis of variance is the preferred method for testing a mediating relationship. And finally, taking into account the role of a mediator with an outcome variable reduces or eliminates the relationship of an independent variable with the outcome variable. Okay, think about each of these for a second and pause the video now. Okay, if you answered D, you got it right. A characteristic of a mediator is that it is both related to an independent variable and weakens the independent variable's relationship with an outcome variable once the mediator is accounted for. Okay, here's another question. Which of the following would be an example of a moderating variable? A, the role of the amygdala in regulating a fear response in a cat to an aversive stimulus. B, a strong positive relationship between the number of dogs in a city and the number of crimes. Human population density can account for the relationship. Or C, level of self-esteem in the relationship between internalizing coping style and body dissatisfaction in middle school girls. So why don't you pause the video and think about your answer, and when you are ready to resume, hit restart for the video. Yeah, this one probably took a little bit of thought. Answer A is not correct since the amygdala mediates a fear response. If we remove the amygdala, cats generally show no fear of stimuli, which they probably should fear. So thus the amygdala mediates but does not moderate the fear response. Answer B similarly is not correct because it is an example of a mediating relationship. Although there is a strong relationship between number of dogs in a city and the number of crimes, that relationship depends entirely on the number of people living in the city. So once the number of people is taken into account, the relationship between number of dogs and number of crimes virtually disappears. Answer C, though, is correct. And in the actual study by Mitchell and colleagues in 2012, and internalizing coping style was found to be related to overall body dissatisfaction in middle school girls. That relationship, however, was moderated by self-esteem. The lower a girl's self-esteem, the stronger the relationship between internalization and body dissatisfaction. Hey, great job. Understanding the difference between moderating and mediating variables can be difficult at times, but it's important to know the differences. As clinical researchers and aspiring clinical researchers, a good part of what we do involves trying to understand the role of moderators and mediators. And as an aspiring clinician yourself, keep these principles in mind so that you can provide your future clients the highest possible quality of care, and you can also produce sophisticated clinical research.